Well, welcome. It is my pleasure to introduce to my guests, to my students. My guest today, Dr. Eileen Hunt Botting. She is professor of political science at Notre Dame University, and she is, I don't think it's hyperbole to say, one of the, if not the most foremost Wollstonecraft experts kicking around today. And not to speak ill of any of my previous guests, right? But typically when I pull in my friends to do this, they are not, these renowned experts on the thinker that we're here to discuss. They were just the suckers who said yes at any given moment. But with Dr. Botting, it's just what a unique, rare privilege to be able to introduce my introductory students to a scholar of your caliber. We would be here all day if I rattled off everything, and you would get more and more embarrassed. But I do want to just have some highlights. So Dr. Botting's 2016 book, Wollstonecraft, Mill and Women's Human Rights. Let me see, her most recent book, which I actually haven't had the chance to read in full yet, focuses on Mary Wollstonecraft's very famous daughter, Mary Shelley, and her political science fiction. And then, I'll tout one more. This is just a magisterial volume, a compendium of scholarly reflections on Wollstonecraft's enduring philosophical legacies and significance that Dr. Botting is a co-editor of, and I had the privilege of being included. Dr. Botting has done more for, I think, Wollstonecraft in the field of political theory, political philosophy, than really just about anybody I can think of. So it's such a privilege to have you here. All right, now that I've sufficiently embarrassed you and hyped you,
that's right.
Let's dive into this. So I'm curious to know, when did you first read Mary Wollstonecraft or encounter Mary Wollstonecraft, and what do you remember about that experience?
Yes, that is a great question. In fact, I think your students will be very surprised to hear my first reading of Wollstonecraft's story. So I was a sophomore at Bowdoin College, and I was an English literature major, and I was taking a romanticism course. I was reading the standard Norton anthology. And I was really excited because I wanted to read Wordsworth and Coleridge and Keats and Shelley, as in Percy. And I had a very traditional patriarchal view of what constituted the canon in English literature. And I was really surprised when my very young female teacher who had just graduated from Cornell with her PhD in English literature, was actually an incredible runner. She ran at Cornell. She was a tremendous athlete too. She taught a lot of women writers, and she taught a lot of women who weren't known for poetry. And I was there for poetry. I at that time of my life, I believe poetry was the epitome of literature, and I was there to read the classics. And I honestly felt gypped by the class. I was upset. I was like, why are we reading prose writers? Why are we reading prose? We're supposed to be reading poetry. And then we're reading these women that I've never heard of. And so we read some snippets from The Rights of Woman in the anthology. And I didn't mind it. But I think my issue was one of genre. I just didn't get it. Like, why is this here alongside Coleridge and Wordsworth? And I went in to see my professor, and I was actually upset. I said, you need to explain to me, like, why this is considered appropriate for a course that's supposed to be on romanticism.
And what was her response?
I think she was remarkably patient with me. I mean, I think I've had moments like this in my career now, where students come in to see me, and they're questioning something about my teaching method or my choices of text to read or my approach to the material. And I can either I sense that or they're direct with me, and I think I've learned how to deal with that. And I always think back to how I was and the way my professors handled me. And she gave me some good answers. She said, well, we're gonna be reading a little bit of Dorothy Wordsworth's prose writing, because we think of it as a source for a lot of what Wordsworth did in his poetry. And we think of Wollstonecraft too as a great prose writer who had tremendous impact on the greatest poets of the period, who often were men. But isn't it really interesting that these great male poets took such inspiration from these women's prose writings, which often took a more personal character, were in journals, or in Wollstonecraft's case, were rooted in her life story, were often written in epistolary form, or written in fictional form, a kind of quasi-autobiographical form. And isn't it interesting that the great male poets of the age took such inspiration from women's personal writing and prose writing, and they could transform it into poetry that we all remember. I basically bought the argument, although I didn't truly become a Wollstonecraft fan until I went to Cambridge and I was reintroduced to Wollstonecraft in the context of the history of political thought. And I had a tutorial with Melissa Lane on feminist political thought, in which I read Wollstonecraft. I also had a tutorial on the French Revolution with Silvana Tomaselli, and read Wollstonecraft alongside Burke and Rousseau there. But from that point, I was hooked. At that point, I really identified with Wollstonecraft's ideas, especially her ideas about women and athleticism, because at the time I was a runner. And I really loved what Wollstonecraft had to say about the importance of girls being encouraged to have time to play outdoors in the same way boys did in the time. And
that great line from the second Vindication, right? Every child is a romp.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yeah. No, she was a genuine advocate of, in some sense, what today we would call recess. She was also an advocate of physical education for girls, for really co-educational sports for the sexes. In some ways, she anticipated Title IX and everything that has meant for women in this country. From my generation on. And so at that point, I really started to think more deeply about Wollstonecraft as a philosopher, particularly on questions of the body, sexual difference, and also rights. What constitutes women's rights, and how are they the same as or different than the rights of men?
I love this story, Professor Botting. I love, because now, right, when I think of you and your own scholarship, you're so you're so disrespectful in a wonderful way of genre, right? You just defy all these boundaries, and you read things that have no business, quote unquote, being read as texts of political philosophy or political theory as such. And so I love to think of, the undergraduate, Eileen being so eager to police these boundaries. Exactly, right? It's a novel, right? What are you doing reading it like it's philosophy, right? But that's great. I think it's wonderful to see how we grow and evolve and change as thinkers. And I hope my students will take from that story, right, a reminder to be open to those shifts and evolutions as they occur, and to not flee, right, but to kind of lean into that. Wonderful. All right, so my next question, and you've already kind of gestured towards some of this in your remarks, But it's only been really in the past 30 years that Mary Wollstonecraft has been read as a political thinker, that she's been included in course syllabi like mine, Introduction to Political Thought. I think that there's been a longer appreciation of her importance amongst, scholars of literature and things like that, right? And that's, of course, the context in which you first encountered her as a kind of source for these, poets and whatnot. But, now she is very much, I think, established in this canon. So I was just kind of wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that journey, how it came to be that Wollstonecraft gained this kind of wider audience, and also why you think it took so gosh darn long.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was thinking about this question this morning, and I think the most obvious answer to me is that it took Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Men to be recognized as a classic work of political thought. For her to gain entry into the so-called canon, because it was written in dialogue with Edmund Burke.
A very famous man.
Yes. Do you buy my hypothesis? Do you think that's right? And that roughly that coincides with the 1990s.
I think, yeah.
The Rights of Men is not really truly recovered until the 1990s. It really was Silvana's edition in 1995 that did it. But there was scholarship prior to it, like Virginia Shapiro's A Vindication of Political Virtue, which treated the rights of men very seriously as a work of political theory in the context of 18th century political thought. And there were earlier readings of the rights of men, for sure, going back into the late 60s, especially in England, where, for various reasons, I think because copies were available in libraries, you saw English academics at Oxford and Cambridge occasionally making reference to the text, but they'd always say something like, but it's not really well known anymore. And
really important at the time of kind of antiquarian interest. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
But interestingly, actually, Susan Mahler-Oken, one of my favorite feminist political philosophers,
who I think she's right here over my
good. Yes, I have a few works of hers over here too. But Susan Mahler-Oken, when she was doing her BPhil at Oxford in the late 60s, she did her thesis on Wollstonecraft and Mill and William Thompson. And she has a whole chapter on Wollstonecraft, and she treated A Vindication of the Rights of Men very seriously as a work of political philosophy. And so it's interesting to see Oken begin with Wollstonecraft, and yet, as you know, in her later work, Wollstonecraft just drops out. Right. She's mentioned a few times, in her major works, but usually in just a list of great women of the past, which was a similar trope among a number of feminist historians of political thought in the 20th century. Betty Friedan does this in the Feministique with regard to Wollstonecraft and other great women of the past. Simone de Beauvoir does it in The Second Sex. So you get a little list, and Wollstonecraft's usually on the list, right, of great women who inspired feminism of the present.
Right. They're significant because of us now.
Yeah, in some ways, yes. In some ways, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then read my book. My ideas actually sum up what feminism truly is. Yeah. But you didn't get a lot of substantive textual analysis of the arguments Wollstonecraft made. And then if you got interest in it, it was usually in the fact that she, as a woman, took on Edmund Burke. Like, she dared to do that. So the kind of gender politics of what Wollstonecraft was doing in the 1790s, which is remarkable. I mean, it really is one of the most amazing dimensions of that text, is that Wollstonecraft had the courage to write this reply, and that she managed to write it in basically about 3 weeks, to be the first person to publish a book-length pamphlet reply to Burke's reflections. There was one earlier pamphlet, but it was about a third it was about a third of the size
Okay.
of Wollstonecrafts. Wollstonecrafts was about 150 pages, and Major John Scott's reply, which came out about 10 days earlier, basically. I mean, she was about a week after him. His was about 50 pages. So, I mean, and it's impressive he got his out, very quickly after Burke's Reflections came out on November 1st. But still, that Wollstonecraft writes a book-length version, between November 1st and I believe the earliest possible date it came out was November 24th. Oh my goodness.
It's remarkable.
I mean, right. I mean, you have to leave some time in there for just it going to press, right? So she couldn't have possibly used all 24 of those days to write it,
Yeah, and I mean, this is true. This is just I think a characteristic of Wollstonecraft that I've always been most impressed by. Correct me if I'm factually wrong here, but like her entire kind of intellectual production happened in like a decade, right?
Yes.
And she was incredibly prolific. And I've always found that just to be such a feat, because I am sort of constitutionally the opposite as a writer. I'm a bleeder, right? The words come slowly, but they just erupt out of Wollstonecraft, and
it's a nice way to put. That's a nice way to put it. I like that idea that there's something about her life in that last decade of her life that was a kind of eruption of feeling and argumentation, and in some ways she couldn't help herself. I mean, she had a lot to say and she said it. I mean, you wonder sometimes if she just had a sense of just how short her life was going to be.
Right. Yeah, because for my students, I've invited them to listen to some supplemental content that gets into some of the biography. But yeah, she died very young at 37, I think, or
38, I think.
38. Okay.
Yeah.
Just soon after giving birth to her second child, the author, Mary Shelley, right?
That's right.
All right. So there's a little bit of background and context on how it came to be that Wollstonecraft is considered part of the canon. So my next question is probably my favorite question to ask everybody who I have come visit with my students, because we're all nerds who have devoted our lives, for better or for worse, to this endeavor. And I think a big motive for a lot of us is just our passion and love of language. So what's your favorite passage from any of Wollstonecraft's writings? Share it with us, and then tell us a little bit about why you love that passage so much.
Well, I was thinking about this one too this morning, and I think because I'm a scholar of Frankenstein now, I have to say that it's the line from the Vindication of the Rights of Women where she says roughly, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." Because later on in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley has the creature claim that he has this kind of all-controlling power over his father. He says, "You must obey me," and I think Mary Shelley may have been playing on this idea that this Wollstonecraftian idea that the worst thing that you can ever allow anyone is this sense of having total power over them. No matter who they are, whether they are your spouse or your child, your sibling. The worst thing you could ever do is to make that person feel that you have total control over them. And so I always liked Wollstonecraft's sentiment, and I think Mary Shelley did too. The idea that true respect, true love would mean letting yourself and letting others have power over themselves, and enjoying that fact that they have autonomy, they have this ability to control themselves, to share themselves freely, to enjoy their physical freedom, and to not be dominated or controlled.
Yeah, and I love this passage as well, and this sentiment, and I think it's so important, right? Because a trope that recurs throughout kind of history of political thought is this response whenever you have a kind of aggrieved, oppressed group demanding equality, rights, justice, there is a chorus of opponents to that demand who are kind of hearing those pleas for equality and for justice, kind of threat to just reverse to flip the script, right? And to have, I think of John Adams in his reply to his wife's letter, right, that she writes to him saying, please remember the ladies as you're framing this new code of laws, for the what would become the United States. And he replies in a private letter to her saying like, oh, I know you're just joshing with me. We would never willingly subject ourselves to the tyranny of the petticoat. Sort of saying like, if we were to extend equal citizenship to women, what we would in fact be doing is allowing women to kind of tyrannize and dominate us. We have tyrannized and dominated women, right? But so what Wollstonecraft is doing there, right, is trying to sort of counteract that criticism by saying, no, like what I'm asking for is equality, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Another point in the Vindication of the Rights of Women, I think in her critique of Rousseau, she says, I want equality, not empire, which is just brilliant rhetoric. I mean, you can see why she was an inspiration to the poets, right? I mean, right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So final question. Are Wollstonecraft's ideas still relevant to us today? Where, if anywhere, do you see her influence visible? And, kind of in short, why inflict this old dusty 18th century tome right on our students today? What's the point?
I think Wollstonecraft has never been more relevant. I mean, the thing I would point all your students to, and I think you already have, is that last November there was this huge international debate about the statue for Wollstonecraft that was erected on Newington Green last November, and it was a really interesting debate. It was a very heated debate. It was a very passionate debate, but it really brought to the public eye a number of reasons why Wollstonecraft is still relevant to people who may or may not have ever read her work. And so one of the things the debate on the statue raised is this question about women's beauty and women's appearance. What does it mean for a woman to be considered beautiful? What does it mean for us to construct artworks that represent female or feminine beauty or womanly beauty? Can one do that in a way that's compatible with feminist ideas?
Because a wing of the criticism there, right? The statue, if I'm recalling, it's a female figure, right?
It's a confluence of feminine forms, and it kind of culminates in a very small statuette, which is silvery and futuristic. A kind of icon of modern or even kind of postmodern womanhood, really, which I find very interesting because in some ways it's not, it certainly is not a kind of classical sculpture, in the sense that, say, the Medusa statue that was erected in New York to great criticism as well. It is, I read it as a kind of contemporary feminist work of art, kind of a work of public art, intentionally provocative public art, and with lots of gestures to contemporary post-structuralist gender theory, and that I thought was entirely missing from the public debate.
Right, because the public debate was like, she's naked. Right?
Yeah, it was.
I mean, so like that's I think what stirred.
It's like, oh my God, she's naked.
Yeah, like, oh my God, it's Mary Wollstonecraft. Her breasts are bared in the public space. And you had feminists, right? Like covering the statue up in acts of protest.
You did. It was really Victorian.
Yeah, I mean, boggles the mind. But that was part of the response. I don't know. I guess I'm wondering, because, okay, so I'm anticipating some of my students' reactions to reading her Vindication of the Rights of Women, which they've just started this week. I haven't yet reviewed their assignment, so I don't really know yet what their response is going to be. But typically, a common response I get from kind of first-time readers of the text is they feel like Wollstonecraft is a bit of a prude, right? They feel like maybe those feminists who are out there, you know, covering up the statue are sort of acting in accordance with Wollstonecraft's own ideas about love and romance and sex and sensuality. So I'm wondering, like, what your thoughts are on that, if you could complicate that a little bit, maybe.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, this is an old debate in the literature. I remember when I first encountered it when I was at Cambridge, I found it hard to believe anyone could actually take away from a Vindication of the Rights of Women that she was a prude. I found that a very strange reading from the start. The reason why I found it strange is actually the reason why I was actually attracted to Wollstonecraft's writing and argumentation in the first place, how much emphasis she always placed on the body. You know, she was a philosopher of the body first and foremost. And, you know, just her advocacy of physical education for children shows that. And she has no issues with nudity, basically. I mean, she says that several times in the book. She says, I think children should be taught sex education, and I'm going to teach them the birds and the bees. She literally says that in a footnote.
Yeah, and of course, a rationalization of the exclusion of women from all sorts of public spaces, including educational spaces, were these arguments, right? This kind of phobic aversion to women's bodies. And so she's definitely, I think, trying to counteract that, because that's a major obstacle to women's inclusion in all the places she wants women to be included. She wants us all to get over that.
In some ways, what she was doing was just truly radical and transformative. She was reimagining everything, including what should our attitudes be towards nudity? Like, what should our attitudes be towards the body, whether it is a male or a female body or an intersex body? Because she actually references at least one person who may have been intersex or trans by our contemporary definition, and
on, right?
Yeah, Madame de Eon, as one of in her list of great women, and so she even affirms the gender identity of Madame de Eon as a woman, which I think is very powerful for us as we look back to Wollstonecraft as a resource for a kind of progressive and futuristic feminism that anticipates many of the themes of our contemporary debates. And these were all dimensions of Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women that were entirely missing from the debate last November. They never made it into the papers. And I think that's unfortunate. You know, I think that your students, I hope, if they choose to engage these themes in their writing, I mean, I think they can really go after the dimensions of Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women in particular that speak to contemporary debates on gender, sex, sexuality, the body, in ways that resonate with us today. And so maybe look for similarities more than differences. And I think they might find some surprises in there.
That's great advice. I think that there is a temptation, right, whenever you're reading an old book, to think it has nothing, that we live in such a progressive, enlightened age, and there's nothing we could possibly learn from the past. So always suspicious of that, right, impulse to be dismissive and look down your nose at.
We might be the prudes. I mean, you know, honestly, the 1790s was pretty radical.
They were beheading kings. We're not doing
that's right.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Botting, for taking the time to share you've forgotten more about Wollstonecraft than I will ever know. It's such a privilege to be able to share your wealth of wisdom and insight with my students, and I'm grateful for you taking the time to do it.
Lorna, this has been such an honor for me, and I look forward to sharing your video series with my own students.
All right, excellent.
Cool.